Thank you very much, Deborah and Sylvia and Aviva. It's such an honor to be speaking here from this pulpit, a pulpit that has been shared by a great many really fine rabbis in the past and in the present. Before I begin, let me just make sure of two things. First of all, there's a handout. I hope that everyone has the handout. If you don't, maybe you could raise your hand and people could bring forward. In the front row, we still need a few. The handout, by the way, you can keep the handout. Frankly, Shavuot is only a few days away, and studying from this handout would actually be a very fine thing to do on Shavuot. So please feel free to keep this. I also just want to make sure, is the mic working? Okay. I'm just over here if I'm... put this away so that we don't get too much feedback. Okay. So we're actually in mittendrin. We are sort of in the middle of things since I began talking about the topic, what happened at Mount Sinai, what happened on the first Shavuot on Friday night, and I want to pick up the discussion from where we were. But I'd like to begin by just reviewing some of what I said on Friday night to set the scene for what we'll be talking about today. I began on Friday night by quoting a few lines from a book by Abraham Joshua Heschel, Zichrono Livracha, somebody with whom Rabbi Orenstein was quite close in his days as a student and afterwards. And so I think it's an appropriate way to begin both these lectures. If you could take a look on page 7 of the handout, we took a look at two lines from Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, God in Search of Man. On page 185, Professor Heschel wrote, "As a report about Revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash." The Bible itself is a midrash. And so Professor Heschel here is sort of erasing the boundary between the Bible and later Jewish interpretation of the Bible, is erasing the boundary between what we can call Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, pointing out that there's something in the Bible itself which has the character of midrash, that is to say, which has the character of an interpretation of Revelation, a reaction to Revelation. Whereas normally we think, well, the Bible is God's revelation, and then in rabbinic literature, we find the Jewish people's reaction to and interpretations of God's revelation. Professor Heschel is suggesting here that, no, actually, even in the Bible itself, we're getting a reaction to an interpretation of Revelation, so that the Bible itself is already dialogical. The Bible itself is not something that came down simply from heaven, but is something to which we, the Jewish people, contributed. The Bible itself is already dynamic, not static, dialogical, not simply top-down. The same idea is picked up on page 274, where Professor Heschel writes, "Thus, Judaism is based upon a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation, upon the will of God and upon the understanding of Israel. There is a partnership of God and Israel in regard to both the world and the Torah. He created the earth and we till the soil. He gave us the text and we refine and complete it." So we're getting this idea again of dialogue, of partnership, and the assertion that already in the Bible itself we find that dialogue, that partnership, that midrash taking place. Now this has become a very familiar idea of modern Jewish theology, but what I pointed out on Friday night is that a very careful reading of the account of Matan Torah, the account of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, shows us that already the Bible itself, the book of Exodus itself, suggests that within the words of the Bible, and perhaps even within the words of the Ten Commandments, we may have some degree of human interpretation, human reaction, human translation of God's revelation. I'd just like to review a little bit what we saw in the passage from Exodus on Friday night. It's the passage that starts on page 1 of the handout. I pointed out that there were 5 ambiguities that occur in the account of Revelation in Exodus chapters 19 and 20. In 5 distinct ways, those chapters make us wonder, what exactly did the Israelites experience? What did they perceive? What did they hear at Mount Sinai? And more particularly, they make us wonder, did the Israelites at Mount Sinai hear the Aseret HaDibrot, hear the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments? Did the Israelites hear the Decalogue directly from God, or did the Decalogue come to Israel through the mediation of the prophet, of the sage Moses? And I talked about how this is actually a very, very theologically important question. If it is the case that Moses was simply a stenographer who repeated God's words exactly, and that the people heard some of God's words commanding the mitzvot exactly, then it is probably the case that we human beings and the Jewish people have little right to get into the system of covenantal law in the Bible and in rabbinic literature, what comes later to be known as halakha. If the first laws came literally from God, from heaven, and were enunciated by God, it's probably the case that we have relatively little right to go into the system, into the halachic system, the system of covenantal law, and make changes as time goes on. The job of Moses' successors, if Moses was just a stenographer, or maybe I shouldn't say just, because really that's a very exalted position. If Moses had the exalted position of being God's stenographer, then the job of the sages, the rabbis, who are Moses' successors, is to continue the stenography. That is to say, their job is to receive this tradition and to pass the tradition on unchanged. On the other hand, if Am Yisrael, if the Jewish people at Mount Sinai didn't hear specific words coming mipi hagvura, coming from the mouth of God, as it were, but rather everything came through Moses' intermediation, so that Moses had to interpret what may have been a non-verbal revelation into human language, into the Hebrew language. If Moses was an interpreter, in a sense a translator, then one can imagine that it might be appropriate for Moses' successors in later generations up until the present and into the future to continue the process of interpretation, of translation. It is inevitably the case, through no fault of anybody, that translations never fully reflect the original. It is always the case that different generations have to come up with their own new translations of some static original, because language changes, society changes. I mentioned the other night, if we read a translation of Homer from 100 years ago, they don't really speak to us. We need to read a new translation of Homer. So if Moses was translating, then perhaps it is our right, maybe even our responsibility as the successors of Moses, to continue the work of translation. And that will mean, among other things, that it is to some degree possible for human beings today to enter the halachic system and to make modifications to that system, to enter the system of covenantal law that we Jews are required to observe, and to work on that system to make sure that we feel that it is appropriately reflecting the will of a just and merciful God. And if we find something that doesn't seem to reflect the will of a just and merciful God, then it might be appropriate for us to say, you know, we think that our ancestors, that our forebears may have made a mistake in translation here, and it may be possible for the community to come up with a new version of that law. So this question of what exactly did Am Yisrael hear? What did the Jewish people hear at Mount Sinai? And more specifically, did the Ten Commandments come directly from God or only through Mosaic intermediation? That's actually a very, very major theological question, especially for modern Jews. And what I was pointing out was that the notion that revelation involved dialogue and partnership, that there was translation and interpretation happening as part of the revelation from the very beginning, that notion that we associate with Professor Heschel's work is already suggested in the book of Exodus, in the passages that we looked at on Friday night, that suggest the possibility that Moses might have been the intermediary even for the Ten Commandments themselves. There were 5 ambiguities. Let me just quickly review a few of them, because as we go into Deuteronomy, the specifics will become important. One question was, well, it's clear that the people heard a kol in Hebrew, a kol that came from the divine. The question then is, what does the Hebrew word kol mean? Looking at 2 different translations, one the old JPS translation from 1917, one the new JPS translation from 1985, we saw that it is correct to translate kol as voice, but it is also equally correct to translate kol as thunder. We also saw that Exodus chapter 19 hints in certain ways that, yeah, it really should be voice, and also hints in other ways that it really should be thunder. If the people heard God's voice speaking something like human language, that means that the people heard the Ten Commandments, heard specific words. These are not Moses' words. These are literally words that came from heaven. That leads us to one kind of Jewish theology. If the people heard God communicating in thunder, not in language, but in an overwhelming signification of God's commanding presence, that leads us to the idea that Moses was an interpreter, a translator, and that leads us to another Jewish theology. So that was one really crucial ambiguity. Does kol mean voice or thunder? And we saw that the text doesn't allow us to decide. The text actually seems to want us to engage in this debate. We also saw that there was the passage in Exodus chapter 20, this is towards the bottom of page 2 of the handout, in which the people go up to Moses, and they say to Moses, you speak to us, I'm reading here from the bottom of page 2, you speak to us, and we will obey, but let not God speak to us, lest we die. This overwhelming event of revelation was frightening, it was overwhelming, it was too much, and so the people say to Moses, you've got to be the intermediary. And the question that comes up is, when did this conversation take place? When did the people say, we want you to be the translator? Did it take place after the giving of the Ten Commandments, in which case they did hear the Ten Commandments being spoken by God to the people, and it's only the rest of the Torah that will come through Moses' intermediation? Or did this conversation take place possibly during the giving of the Ten Commandments, in which case they heard some but not all of the Decalogue directly from God? Or did it take place before the giving of the Ten Commandments, in which case they heard none of the Decalogue, none of the laws coming directly from God? And we saw that although the placement of the text immediately after, the placement of this dialogue between Moses and the people, immediately after the text of the Decalogue, might initially suggest to us that this conversation took place after God spoke the Ten Commandments. In fact, for grammatical reasons that I won't review here, for grammatical reasons, actually, it is pretty clear that the conversation did not take place after the giving of the whole Ten Commandments. It either took place during the giving of the Ten Commandments or before. It's impossible to decide, I think, whether it was during or before, but grammatically, one of those two is the most likely possibility. Finally, just to mention a third of the ambiguities. Actually, we didn't mention this one, so I'll mention this one today. If you take a look on page 3 of the handout, it's possible, well, the Hebrew text, of course, doesn't include punctuation, but it's possible to punctuate the text in 2 different ways at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments, really the last verse of chapter 19, the first 2 verses of chapter 20. One could say, option number 1 on page 2, and Moses went down to the people and spoke to them, . Then God spoke all these words, saying, quotation mark, I am the Lord your God, etc., etc. This implies that God spoke the Ten Commandments to the people. It's also possible to punctuate this, however, according to option number 2. And Moses went down to the people and said to them, quotation mark, okay, so now we're getting Moses' voice, God spoke all these words, saying, single quotation mark, I am the Lord your God. In other words, does the narrator of the book of Exodus quote God speaking directly to the people, or does the narrator quote Moses, quote God speaking, so that the Ten Commandments come only through Moses? Both of these ways of punctuating the text are possible. Both of them are slightly problematic in different ways. It would have been very, very easy in the Hebrew language to write this clearly so that it was clear, even without punctuation, how many different voices we're getting here, 2 or 3. But the text has deliberately been phrased in an ambiguous way. We also notice, by the way, that those words, God spoke these words saying, are unprecedented because that type of phrasing, God spoke or God said these words saying, appears hundreds of times in the Bible, literally in every other case. I've actually gone through and checked. In every other case, we're told to whom God spoke. And yet on this occasion, the most important of all the revelations, we're not told whether God spoke El Moshe, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe limor, to Moses, or El Ha'am, to the people. Again, if you're very used to biblical phrasing, it's a very strange verse. There are hundreds of other cases, and you always get that El, to, or sometimes a different preposition is used, but you always get some preposition indicating to whom God spoke. Here, the most important of all the cases, the one that sort of is the paradigmatic case of Revelation, that all the other ones merely echo, we're not told to whom God spoke. So again and again, Exodus chapters 19 and 20 want us to wonder, how did we get this binding law? It's clear that the law is binding, but is the law entirely divine law, which probably we humans shouldn't be messing around with too much, or is this law the result of dialogue and cooperation between God and humanity? In fact, maybe the specifics are all produced by a human being as a way of sort of instantiating this law, this command, an abstract command that comes from God. Okay, so that's the review of Deuteronomy. That's the review of Exodus. Now I want to move on to the book of Deuteronomy. Jesse, by the way, I wonder if we might turn the volume down a slight bit. It just seems a little echoey. So why don't we try going down just a little bit. So the book of Deuteronomy reviews the story or retells the story from the book of Exodus that we just saw, or that I just summarized. The book of Deuteronomy, according to us modern biblical scholars, was written by a group of Levi'im, a group of Levites, who lived later than the authors of the story that we were just looking at in Exodus. The verses that we were looking at from Exodus actually all come from what biblical scholars call the E document or the Elohist document. The book of Deuteronomy is based on the Elohist document, but makes a variety of changes to the Elohist document's material as it retells some of those stories and as it really re-legislates some of the laws. So let's take a look at how Deuteronomy alters, agrees with, or maybe diverges from its main source, which was the E document, the Elohist document that we saw in Exodus chapters 19 and 20. So I'm just going to read some passages from Deuteronomy, and I again want you thinking about the questions according to Deuteronomy. I'll just say D, which is how we biblical scholars refer to this author, or this set of authors. How does D portray the revelation? According to D, what exactly did the people hear and perceive? And in particular, according to D, Did the Ten Commandments come directly from God to Am Yisrael, to the Jewish people, or did it go through Moses' intermediation, Moses' interpretation, Moses' translation? And what tells us that as we're going through? So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, and so from here on out we're hearing Moses speaking to the people in the first person. By the way, this speech that Moses is making to the Israelites, he's making this 40 years later. This is 40 years after the Exodus, 40 years after Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, just before Moses' own death, and just before the Israelites were about to cross the river Jordan into the land of Canaan. So Moses says to the Israelites, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day. Study them and observe them faithfully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb." D and E refer to Mount Sinai consistently as Horeb. Two other authors of the Torah refer to the mountain with a more familiar term, Sinai, but D always says Horeb. It was not, so the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us here, who is here today. Face to face, or directly, the Lord spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire. Now, let me pause here for a second. Verse 5, you'll see in the New JPS translation, is sort of set off by dashes. It's a parenthetical comment that interrupts a sentence. In Hebrew, when you say that God spoke, and then you go on to quote God, you use the word lemor, which I guess we could translate as saying. In a way, lemor really functions almost as a quotation mark. So when it says in verse 4, the Lord spoke to you, that verb, spoke, is leading directly into the saying that you see at the end of verse 5. So the sentence that takes up the rest of verse 5 is a parenthetical that interrupts. For the moment, I want to skip the parentheses and just read the sentence in verse 4 without the interruption. We're going to come back to verse 5 later, but for now, let's just read the verse without the interruption. Face to face, the Lord spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, etc., etc., and then we get the text of the Ten Commandments. At the end of the text of the Ten Commandments, we read in verse 19, so there's a little white space where I'm just saving space by not including the whole text of the Ten Commandments. So it's starting at verse 19 in the English, which is numbered as verse 22 in the Hebrew. If you're following along in Hebrew, we read that Moses said to the people, the Lord spoke those words, those and no more, to your whole congregation at the mountain, with a mighty voice out of the fire and dense clouds. He inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, which he gave to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was ablaze with fire, you came up to me, all your tribal heads and elders, and said, the Lord our God has just shown us his majestic presence, and we have heard his voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that man may live, though God has spoken to him. Let us not die then, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we shall die. For what mortal has ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? You go closer and closer and hear all the Lord our God says. And then you tell us everything that the Lord our God tells you, and we will willingly do it. I'll go as far as that. I'd like to suggest, actually, and we're going to see this in this passage, and we're also going to go back a page and see another passage. I'd like to suggest, well, I told you Friday night and again today, that there are 5 ambiguities in the book of Exodus about the nature of Matan Torah, the nature of the law giving, the revelation at Sinai. Today what I want to suggest to you is that when you read Exodus chapter 5, Exodus chapter 4 carefully, it's very, very obvious that the authors of Deuteronomy, heard my lecture. They clearly have listened to my lecture because they respond to every single one of those ambiguities. So just in this passage, how do you see the authors responding to the ambiguities back in Exodus chapters 19 and 20? How do they answer the question, what exactly did the people hear? Did the revelation go, well, to whom did the revelation go? Any thoughts here? Yes? Mm-hmm. Why does this, so I don't know if everybody heard, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Barbara? Barbara said that to her it sounds like the voice went to the people. What makes you say that? I agree.
Their reaction. It's like, that we now see that we've heard God's voice and lived, but let us not hear it any longer. You listen to the rest and tell us because we're still afraid we're going to die.
Great. You listen to they're very afraid, and they say, you listen to the rest because we're afraid that we're going to die. I want to come back to that. That's really important phrasing, but we've got some other hands.
Line 4 says, panim b'panim, face to face. So that implies that there was the presence of
Yeah, panim, I'm sorry, I don't know your name either. I'm sorry? So Rita points out that verse 4 explicitly says, panim b'fanim, literally face to face. And really, panim b'fanim is a Hebrew idiom that we could also translate more idiomatically as directly. In other words, without intermediation. Obviously, the D authors heard my lecture. I used the word intermediation about 40 times when discussing Exodus chapter 19 and 20. The D authors are responding to the possibility, is it possible that you could read Exodus to say that the Israelites heard the Ten Commandments only through Moses' intermediation? No, panim b'fanim, panim b'fanim. It was directly. Great point, Rita. I'm sorry, I know your name, but I forgot it. Bill, I honestly was going to guess Bill. I really, that was actually the case. Well, verse 5, we're going to come back to verse 5. Verse 5 is my favorite verse in the entire chapter. But again, it's parenthetical, so for the moment, I want us to ignore verse 5. So those of you who didn't read ahead, any other reactions here to what chapter 5, not including verse 5, not including the parenthetical comment, what is chapter 5 saying? Back there? Yeah, the plural form's there. The Lord our God has shown us. We have heard. You get these first-person plural pronouns, both nominative and accusative. And it's actually, you could probably say this more pithily. You could probably phrase this that you don't need both those pronouns, one nominative and one accusative. But I think that the author wants to use these plural pronouns to make it clear. Yes, we heard it. It came to us. Because it's answering that question, did we hear it directly from God, or did it only come through intermediation? So those pronouns in that verse are very, very important. Yes, one more comment over here. Is that a hand? No? Well,
if there were 600 or 6,000 people there who heard the word of God, after that, no one heard the voice of God.
well, this passage doesn't discuss the numbers. There could have been, as yesterday's Parsha said, 603,550 adult males, not including the Levites. But neither Exodus 19 and 20 nor Deuteronomy chapters 4 or 5 go into the question of numbers. So I'm really interested in the language that we're seeing, that we're hearing here in these passages. What do they tell us about what the people heard? The idiom panim b'fanim, directly, without intermediation, the plural forms of the first-person pronouns, and very, very significantly, that phrasing of the story of the people talking to Moses. All of these are indicating that the people heard the Ten Commandments directly from God. Actually, you had pointed out, or somebody over here, Barbara had pointed out, that in verse 21 and 22, we get the interesting language, especially in 22, let us not die, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we shall die. Let's compare that to the corresponding verse back in Exodus. So back in the handout on page 2, we're looking at the bottom of page 2. This is verse 16 or 19, depending on how you count it. The people say to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will obey, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." What's the difference in phrasing? In Exodus, it was, "Let not God speak to us, lest we die." In Deuteronomy, it's, "If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we shall die." The phrasing here makes it clear that they did hear the voice of God. They heard God saying something. In Exodus, actually, the phrasing doesn't suggest that they've heard anything at all from God. They're already frightened. They may already be frightened before God even started speaking. The language there allows us to think that they didn't hear God's uttering the Ten Commandments, but the language in Deuteronomy makes quite clear that yes, they did hear something from God, and they didn't want to continue hearing from God. So here I think it's clear that they heard the Aseret HaDibrot, they heard the Ten Commandments, and they didn't want to go on hearing more of them. In fact, the phrasing in verse 19 is especially significant on page 4. This is Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 19. "The Lord spoke those words, those and no more, to your whole congregation." In verse, it's verse 22 is the way that it's numbered in the Hebrew side of the page. "Et hadavarim ha'ele dibir Adonai el kol kahalchem." Your whole congregation heard it. Not just your leader, not just one prophet on top of the mountain, not 70 elders who were representatives, not just the Levi'im or the Kohanim. No, kol kahalchem, you all heard it. The language here in several different ways is making clear that the people did hear the Ten Commandments. I want to come to verse 5, but first let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, which I turned to the wrong page. Normally I start with Deuteronomy 4 and then go to Deuteronomy 5, but today I'm going backwards. So let's go to the bottom of page 3, and I think we'll see the same idea showing up, the same idea that showing up that the people did hear the whole Ten Commandments. I'll start actually at verse 10. Moses reminds the people of, and here's what Moses says, "The day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, 'Gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on earth, and may so teach their children.'" In order that they may hear my words is the exact phrasing there. Ve'ashmi'em et divarai. We're talking about words. What question are we answering here? We're answering the question, what does the word kol mean? Again, the author of Deuteronomy clearly heard my lecture, knew that the word kol in Exodus is ambiguous, and by using the word divarai, my words, is telling us kol means a voice, God's spoken words, not just in thunder. Let's skip to verse 12. "The Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice." The Hebrew here is kol divarim atem shom'im. Kol divarim, we get that word kol, the sound, and then we get the clarification divarim, of words, the sound of words. The author of Deuteronomy here knows that kol back in Exodus is ambiguous, and Deuteronomy is trying to clarify it was the kind of kol that you hear coming from the larynx of a human being. It was a kol that spoke words, not only a kol of thunder. So Deuteronomy here is clearly trying to, I think, comment on or interpret Exodus. You see what Professor Heschel means when he says that the Bible is already a midrash. Deuteronomy is clearly commenting on Exodus. Deuteronomy knows that Exodus was ambiguous. Let's make it clear that we should read it one way and not the other way. Yes, Barbara?
But it's saying here, you heard the sound of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice. So it's a voice, but maybe they couldn't comprehend the words themselves because there was no shape to it.
I don't necessarily know about that. I mean, on my way down On the way down on the Garden State Parkway, as I often like to do on the Garden State Parkway, I was listening to a Bruce Springsteen CD. I didn't see Bruce, but I heard him perfectly well, and I understood the words. Granted, I kind of know the words by heart anyway, but you can, and even in antiquity, you could hear a person from a distance without seeing the person. A person on one, like, could be hiding behind a rock and talking to you. So not seeing the shape doesn't mean that they didn't understand the words.
Sometimes a rock singer, let's say, is singing into the microphone, and you hear the words, and you hear something, but you can't make out what the words are. You know, if you had to say what the song was about, you wouldn't, yeah.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah. It is, that is possible. I think another understanding, even back in Exodus, of voice might be it was a very loud voice, so loud that you could sense that it was speaking words, but you couldn't understand the words. The great biblical scholar Baruch Schwartz from Hebrew University, Gesundheit, Baruch Schwartz from Hebrew University suggests that the people did hear the voice, but that, as he put it, it was like listening to a really loud radio being played by your neighbors upstairs in the apartment upstairs. You can tell it's a voice, but you can't actually make out what the words are because it's loud, but it's unclear. And Baruch then added, and also it's in Hungarian. The year that I read that article, I was actually in a Jerusalem apartment underneath people who played their radio really, really loud in Hungarian. This interpretation of Baruch's really stuck with me. So that may be the case. I think that may even be the case back in Exodus. One way or the other, Deuteronomy, twice in just 2 verses, is emphasizing that it was words. So even if you didn't understand the words exactly, Moses presumably did, and therefore he is acting as stenographer, not as interpreter, not as translator. There's another hand, but let me just finish up making a point over here. One other thing that's going on, it's a little clearer in the Hebrew than the English. If you look through this passage, there are a lot of, the word you appears several times. And the word you, it's in Hebrew, is always plural. In English, we kind of lose the effect of this unless you want to, right near Newark in Jersey City, I suppose we could go with yous. Or if there are any Southerners here, we could go with y'all. But it would actually be better to translate these with y'all or yous because the plural forms are very important. Over and over again, Moses used these plural second-person forms to say, all of you really did hear this. Y'all heard this. And actually, if you know Hebrew grammar, in most of these cases, the verbal form doesn't require a pronoun at all. The word atem appears, but it's not actually necessary because the verb itself already contains the idea of a second-person plural pronoun. So the fact that these second-person plural form pronouns, these yous or these y'alls, are showing up is, again, emphasizing you all heard this. It wasn't just me. It wasn't one guy on top of the mountain. All of you heard. It was a voice, and you heard words. I think that Deuteronomy is very, very strongly coming down on one side of that ambiguity back in Exodus. It was a voice that spoke words. The actual words of the Ten Commandments aren't a product of Moses' translation or interpretation. They really came from God. Now, I want to get to verse 5, but there's one question or comment over here. That's an absolutely fascinating point, which that's a fascinating point. There is the familiar. I'm sorry, in case you didn't hear. I'm sorry, your name? Pinchas. Pinchas points out that even though Moses says you all heard this, you were all there, God spoke with us that day. Actually, most of the people who were there that day, 40 years ago at Sinai, have died. And many of the people standing there, well, all of the people standing there other than Joshua and Caleb, were either born afterwards or were only children when this event took place. This actually shows that there is the rabbinic interpretation that all generations of Israel were there at Sinai. That rabbinic interpretation really begins with this verse, with this passage, where Moses already seems to be saying, you were really there, even though most of them were born later on. One more question back here. I think, why does it say it was not with our fathers? I think Moses is denying it was with your fathers, even though it really was with the fathers, because he's really trying to emphasize the idea it wasn't only with your fathers that God made this covenant, it was with all of us. We were all there. Even though most of us who were standing here hadn't been born yet, it was with us. This covenant is not just about the past. It's about the present. It's about Hayom. The word Hayom, today, the present, occurs again and again in these passages that talk about the giving of the law as well. The law is always given Hayom. The law is always given today. It's not just an ancestral law, it's our law. God is speaking to us, I think is what Deuteronomy is trying to emphasize. So let me sum up. So Deuteronomy is aware of the ambiguities in Exodus. Deuteronomy is acting as interpretation, as midrash or parshanut on Exodus, and is telling us, I know that you could have read Exodus either this way or that way. The right way to read it is that we all heard the Ten Commandments. It didn't just come through Mosaic intermediation, and therefore I would say that Exodus is going in what you might say is the more orthodox as opposed to progressive direction. It's saying, go with the idea that the details of the law came directly from heaven, and our ability to change them is highly limited. That's the way you should read Exodus. What's interesting, though, is verse 5 in chapter 5. So this is on page 4. That's the parenthetical material that I skipped. If you look at Rashi or Ibn Ezra, the two greatest of the medieval biblical commentators, Rashi and Ibn Ezra already point out that verse 5 is a parenthesis. It's a parenthetical remark, and that the lemor, the saying at the end of verse 5, really belongs to the sentence back on page 4. More recently, a scholar at the Hebrew University named Shmuel Löwenstam, Professor Löwenstam pointed out that this verse 5, is not only parenthetical, it was actually added by a later scribe. He points out that it includes the words ba'it hahi, which means at that time, and he collects all 14 cases of the phrase ba'it hahi that occur in the book of Deuteronomy, and he shows that they're all parenthetical, they're all interruptions, and they often add really new information or even contradict the information found in the context. And from this, Professor Löwenstam speculates, and I think it's a very strong suggestion, that the ba'et hahi, the at that time verses throughout the book of Deuteronomy, are all added by a later scribe, or what's called a glossator. It's not the original authors of Deuteronomy who wrote verse 5. Somebody else wrote verse 5 and added it in. So let's read what this glossator, what this later scribe has to say. The author of Deuteronomy has just said the revelation was direct, panim bifanim. There was no intermediation. The people heard the Ten Commandments directly. The glossator adds into Moses' words, I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. Well, this glossator is completely overturning Deuteronomy's interpretation. Deuteronomy is clear and insistent. There was no intermediation. You heard the Ten Commandments directly. And then the glossator in verse 5 comes and says, of course there was intermediation. You didn't hear them directly. Deuteronomy was trying to clear up the ambiguity from Exodus, and it did so successfully until this scribe comes along and adds back in precisely the possibility that Deuteronomy is trying to deny. Here again, I think we see why we might say that the book of Deuteronomy is already midrash, or maybe we could even say the book of Deuteronomy is one of the first works of rabbinic literature. because we're getting more than one voice in the book of Deuteronomy. We're getting the Tanakama, maybe you could say. We're getting one opinion from the main voice, and then we're getting this Ikeda Amre. We're getting this, but there are those who give us the opposite point of view. Exodus was ambiguous. It allowed for two different readings. Deuteronomy portrays one of those readings and then has this one additional verse that reminds us of the other. This is actually, I think, fascinating from the point of view of Jewish intellectual history, because this tendency to gloss a text, to add a line to a text that brings in another point of view, continues in later Jewish history. To give maybe the most famous example, Maimonides, in his legal code, which is known as the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides in the, about the 13th century or 12th century, I should know that, Maimonides, about 800 years ago, confronted the extraordinary variety of positions on Jewish law. There were lots of different opinions from the Babylonian, already in the Babylonian Talmud, more from the Jerusalem Talmud, then more yet from the Gaonic literature and from literature of Responsa, the She'elot Utshuvot. Knowing what the halacha was getting very difficult, so Maimonides decided, I'm going to write a code. It's not going to include all these different opinions. It's just going to tell you, this is what you should do. Here's what the law is. And he called that code the Mishneh Torah. He takes that title actually from the book of Deuteronomy. There's a passage elsewhere in Deuteronomy where the book of Deuteronomy refers to itself as Mishneh Torah, meaning a repetition of the Torah, because it's retelling stories found back in Exodus and Numbers and retelling laws found back in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So Maimonides chooses Deuteronomy's self-appellation to be the title of his own work, and then he tells us real clearly, okay, here's what the law is. And then already in Maimonides' lifetime, as this work was being copied by hand and spread throughout, very, very quickly, throughout the whole Jewish world, in France, there's another scholar who looks at Maimonides' work, realizes this is like the greatest work of rabbinic literature since the Talmud, but it's leaving out a lot of opinions, and this scholar in France, known as the Ra'avad, Abraham ben David, known by his, or Rabbi Abraham ben David, known by his acronym as Ra'avad, or Ravid, as some people pronounce it. The Ra'avad looks at this and realizes, I don't always agree, though, with the choices that he's made. So he adds into the text, when he's copying over the Mishneh Torah, he adds into the text parenthetical comments where he'll disagree with Rambam. He'll disagree with Maimonides and say, well, Maimonides says this, but you should know that there's also an opinion that says that. So now if you go to a bookstore or take out your phones and go to Sefaria and look at the text of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, it always includes these glosses by the Ra'avad in which the Ra'avad disagrees with Maimonides. Maimonides wants to sort of summarize everything real clearly and get rid of ambiguity. The Ra'avad comes back and includes some of the opinions that Maimonides deliberately did not include. That's exactly what is going on in Deuteronomy chapter 5. In fact, I even like calling this glossator, this scribe that added this material in, I like to refer to this glossator as Proto-Ra'avad. I think we can give him a name, because he's doing to the original Mishneh Torah, to the book of Deuteronomy, exactly what thousands of years later Ra'avad will do to Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. There's something about Jewish religious and intellectual culture that likes to create ambiguity, resolve the ambiguity, and then create a debate between people who want to resolve the ambiguity this way and people who want to resolve the ambiguity that way. What happens here in Deuteronomy is showing us really how deeply Jewish the Bible is. And maybe I could even say how deeply rabbinic. In all seriousness, in modern biblical scholarship, one of the main goals of modern biblical scholarship is to say, well, the Bible's the Bible and Judaism's Judaism, and the Bible was way back then, and Judaism happens a lot later, and a lot of what modern biblical scholarship is doing is trying to sort of separate between ancient Israelite culture and what we think of as Jewish culture. And to some extent, also to separate between medieval and ancient Christian culture and ancient Israelite culture. But this is a case, I think, that is showing us that, no, there's something about the Bible that really is very, very, very deeply Jewish. There are certain intellectual styles that seem to be written into the DNA of the Jewish people from a very, very early stage. And that's what we're seeing here. That's why I think this chapter in Deuteronomy is so fascinating.
Not to get too far into the weeds, it's convenient now that you can put the dash. It's convenient now that you can put the dash. What is there in the Hebrew that suggests that it's a parenthetical or later insertion?
So the question is, what tells us this is a parenthetical in verse 5? Why did Rashi and Ibn Ezra already, centuries ago, identify this as a parenthesis? It's because when we get the diber Adonai, the verb diber, back in verse 4, that diber that verb is functioning along with the infinitive lemor. That lemor belongs to the diber back in verse 4, and therefore this whole other sentence with its own verb in between, that's an interruption. That's an interruption. Yeah, great question. Actually, you know what? I'm going to sort of finish up and then start taking questions. What we've seen today is that Deuteronomy wants to resolve the ambiguities that we saw in Exodus, and speaking using maybe anachronistic, but I still think helpful terminology, we might say that Deuteronomy wants to resolve the ambiguities from Exodus in the Orthodox direction. But the book of Deuteronomy that becomes canonical, that becomes authoritative and sacred in Judaism, and actually in Christianity as well, includes chapter 5, verse 5, which wants to resolve the ambiguity in the other direction. So in Exodus, we sort of get both points of view represented simultaneously by Exodus 19 and 20, because there's a single voice speaking in deliberately ambiguous terms that we could read in a more orthodox or in a more progressive way. Deuteronomy tries to resolve the ambiguity, but it resolves it two different ways. And so that we're seeing the beginning of a debate. Deuteronomy is an interpretive book. It is this rabbinic style book, you might say, but it gives us more than one voice, one of which says that the people heard all of the Ten Commandments, and one of which says the people didn't hear the Ten Commandments. And that tendency will then continue through the rest of Jewish intellectual history. We don't need to go through it now. We don't have time to go through it now, but I think on Shavuot, if you're looking for a great Shavuot project in addition to coming to shul and eating blintzes, as a third Shavuot project, you could kind of look through this handout and take a look, starting at the bottom of page 5, at how there's one side of Jewish interpretive history that picks up the Deuteronomy reading that says, yes, the people heard the whole Ten Commandments. You see that in Midrash Mechilta at the bottom of page 5, in Rashbam and in Seforno from the Middle Ages on the top of page 6. But then there's another strand of Jewish intellectual history going back to the Talmud and continuing into modernity that goes in the other direction, that goes in the direction of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 5, and says, no, the people, they only heard part of the Ten Commandments, they didn't hear all of it. Some opinions, one from the Babylonian Talmud, one from a medieval biblical commentator named Yosef Kara. These commentators say that the people did hear part of the Ten Commandments from God, but only the first two. Only the first two. We then get an opinion on the top of page 7 that some of you may have heard before of a Hasidic master, a Rebbe, who says the people heard only part of the Ten Commandments, but they didn't hear the first two commandments. They didn't even hear all of the first commandment. They didn't even hear all of the first word of the first commandment. All they heard was the first letter of the first word of the Ten Commandments. And then they came to Moses and said, this is just too much for us. This is too overwhelming. The first letter of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew, of course, in Hebrew is what? Aleph. Which sounds like what? Nothing. Now, probably he actually meant they heard the aleph with the vowel kamatz. It would take a long time, and we have to go through some really complicated Hasidic texts to see why he says that. So probably that they heard not just the sound of silence, but probably he's saying that this Hasidic master is saying they heard the sound o. Aleph with a kamatz in Ashkenazic pronunciation that this person would have been using would be o. That's what they heard. They heard God being a teacher. Moshe Idel, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism from Hebrew University, suggests that the Ropshitzer Rebbe here is alluding to what a teacher says to children in their first day of school, to when they're 4 years old or so. He puts the letter Aleph on the blackboard, puts the kamatz underneath it, the vowel kamatz, and he points to it and he says, Komatz Aleph O. That's what God was doing. God was being really not so much of a Rebbe here, not so much of a rabbi. God was being, what's the word I'm looking for here? A Melamed. God is being Melamed to Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael are the 4-year-olds or the 3-year-olds. God is being a Melamed and saying, Komatz Aleph O. But the rest of this only comes through Moses. Even the Anochi, the actual word Anochi, and then all the rest of the text comes through Moses. So what we saw in Deuteronomy was the beginning of an interpretive debate. That debate continues through Jewish intellectual history on pages 5, 6, and 7. I give you just a few examples of that debate. What we're seeing here, I think, then again, is the debate in modern Judaism between a liberal or progressive theology of revelation that we might associate with Abraham Joshua Heschel and an orthodox theology of revelation. It's a very ancient debate. It doesn't just begin in the 19th or the 20th century. And what's important isn't just deciding what side of the debate that you're on, but engaging in the debate, being part of that debate and recognizing the validity of both sides. I frankly think that for us, as capital C conservative Jews, it's very, very important for us to see that this debate that we're engaged in today doesn't begin with our movement, doesn't begin with the founding of JTS or when JTS hired Abraham Joshua Heschel away from HUC in the late 1940s. This debate goes back to the Middle Ages. We can see Rashbam on one side and Yosef Kara on the other side, and Rashbam and Yosef Kara actually knew each other. They both lived in the same place in France. We can see this debate in rabbinic literature between the rabbis quoted in the Babylonian Talmud in the middle of page 6 and the rabbis quoted in Midrash Mechilta in the middle of page 5. And we can see this debate happening in the pages of the Bible itself. We can see this debate happening in Deuteronomy chapter 5 itself. That debate is an ancient debate, and frankly, the side that we're on the one hand, I'm saying we've got to recognize that both sides have validity and need to be taken seriously. But I'll be honest, I really do worry that very often within our movement, within the conservative movement, there are a lot of members who don't really take the conservative point of view that seriously, who think, well, real Judaism is what they're doing over there, and we've got this new thing going on over here, which isn't really for real, but it's what I can handle. But I'm trying to make the point that actually that's not the case. What we're up to theologically has as deep roots as is possible within Jewish history. It goes back to the book of Deuteronomy, it goes back to the book of Exodus, it goes back to what, as a Bible scholar, I would call the D and the E voices within the Pentateuch, the D and the E documents within the 5 books of Moses. And as we get ready a few days from now on Shavuot to receive the Torah again, to be again in that today, that Hayom, in which Torah is given, I think it's very important for us to realize that this is a Torah that is a very, very ancient Torah and simultaneously a very, very modern, a very contemporary Torah, and we should embrace that Torah with both hands. I think I'll go as far as this. There's more on the handout that you can sort of try to figure out on your own why I decided to put it on the handout. I especially recommend that you really read the poem by Yehuda Amichai, which is absolutely beautiful and comes to bear directly, I think, on these issues, or can be read that way. But I'll go as far as that, and I think we have time probably for a few more questions. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Do we even have the Torah Shabbat at all?
Oh, you weren't there Saturday morning.
Oh, sorry.
But that, if you'll allow me to say, that's a brilliant question. That is exactly the question that what I'm saying raises, and that I answered on Saturday morning. But al regel achat, I think that one implication of what I've just been saying is that the Bible, the Torah that is written, the Torah shebichtav, is in fact a form of Torah sheba'al peh. That, or to phrase it a little bit more radically, really, there is no such thing as Torah shebichtav. There is just Torah sheba'al peh that begins with the words Bereshit bara. On Saturday morning, the handout is actually, I think it might be available somewhere, and you could take that handout, or in the book that's mentioned at the very end of this handout, you can read chapter 4, which answers the question that you just asked. The point that I made on Saturday morning and that I make in chapter 4 is that within rabbinic literature, there actually are a fair number of documents, a fair number of statements of various rabbis that are saying, well, really, there is no division between Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh. A statement from the Sifrei, it's in there somewhere, from Sifrei Devarim, is Divrei Torah achat. All words of Torah are one, are a unity, whether we're talking about Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Halacha, Agadah. It's all one thing. There are other statements. There's the one there that's from Midrash Shmot Rabbah, section 47, but it's mentioned elsewhere in rabbinic literature there. I just happen to have quoted it from there, which says explicitly the Torah was given as oral Torah. Subsequently, and for purely practical reasons, not for deep religious, spiritual reasons, for practical reasons, God decided that parts of it would be written down, but the original status of all Torah is oral Torah, and later one subset of the oral Torah became the Torah shebichtav. But no, I think that's a really important that's a really important implication of what we're saying, and but I think Heschel doesn't usually state it quite as openly as I just stated it, but even when he says in that sentence with which I began the lecture, the Bible itself is a midrash on the work of Revelation, on the event of Revelation. If you're saying the Bible is midrash, you're saying the Bible is Torah sheba'al peh. I think again and again Heschel implies this, also Franz Rosenzweig imply it. I think it was a little more radical than either of them wanted to sound, but I think that it is clearly an implication of what they're teaching. Yeah, great question. There's a question way back there, yes? I'm sorry, what? All y'all. Gotcha. Where are you from? Gotcha, okay. From Southern Illinois, though, maybe? Because that's already kind of...
You were talking about this,
Yes.
and you said it's spread out in various places. Are most of them in Deuteronomy and beyond?
No, it's specifically in the book, according to Professor Loewenstein's article from the journal Tarbitz in about 1969, it's specifically in the book of Deuteronomy that the verses that use the phrase ba'it hahi seem to be added by a later scribe. Because again and again, the verses that use the word ba'it hahi are in tension with their surrounding context. Elsewhere in the Bible, this is not necessarily the case. If you find yourself in the book of Exodus or the book of Isaiah and you see ba'it hahi, no, this doesn't apply. What Professor Loewenstein was saying is that at some point in time there was a copyist in biblical times who was copying over a copy of Deuteronomy, and once in a while he would want to add his own 2 cents in the same way that the Ravad added his 2 cents when he copied over Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. And whether on purpose or in a sense almost as a kind of verbal tick, he added the words ba'et hahi. He might have on purpose added the words ba'et hahi when he added these verses to Deuteronomy as a way of kind of identifying his his additions. Or maybe it was even kind of unconscious that sometimes when he was making additions, he would use this phrase, but it's specifically in Deuteronomy. Oh, so the word ba'et ha'im means at that point in time, which really, like, at some level, you don't need to say that. You see what I mean when I say it's kind of like a verbal tick? Sometimes when we're talking, we just add in a few words that really don't add in any meaning that wasn't already obvious. I'm sure if we look at a transcript of my whole lecture, we would find multiple examples of me doing that. That's a normal thing when you're talking, sometimes even when you're writing. So he adds that ba'et ha'im at that point in time. Well, obviously it's at that point in time. That's where we are in the story. It's unnecessary, but it seems to be, well, it's an indicator that this is the work of that glossator, that later scribe. But again, it's specifically in Deuteronomy. It's not the case elsewhere. It may be the case occasionally in the historical books, Samuel and King, well, actually, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Those books are very much influenced by Deuteronomy, and it's possible that the same glossator might have gone through, maybe, but nowhere else in the Bible do the words ba'et ha'im function in the same way. Treasure.
I really agree with your thesis and those things to me. My question is about the text.
Wait, you're not Treasure. But keep on talking. Wait, where is Treasure? From a distance, I thought you were Treasure. Slicha.
But I'm grappling with, really what I'm thinking of is, Shalom is up over before the Ten Commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy are not the same. It's not the same text. And we even acknowledge it when we say, maybe they were said at the same time. So I'm wondering, when the Maestro was saying, no more from God, we can't handle this, were their heads exploded because everything really was coming at them all at once?
Yeah, I think this idea that their heads were exploding because everything's coming at them all at once is something that even Exodus chapter 20, verse 15 is implying, which we looked at on Friday night. That's the verse that says, right after the text of the Ten Commandments, V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. All the people saw the sounds, which I think is the way that the author, the biblical narrator there, is trying to convey the idea maybe that they were having a synesthetic experience. They were having a type of cognition that is not normal. They were having what we might call a mystical experience. So you can't really convey it easily in words, and it was extraordinarily overwhelming to the people and even frightening. But you can imagine that, well, if that's the case, that if the people were seeing sounds, then maybe God could have spoken simultaneously more words than one. That God's voice, and at this point we need to put voice kind of into scare quotes because it's not like a human voice, it works differently than a human voice. It can say two things at once. So yeah, I think that's precisely what Exodus chapter 20 verse 15 is trying to suggest. And when mystical interpreters later on say that, well, we heard Shamor and Zachor in the two different versions of the Ten Commandments, we heard God say, guard the Sabbath and also remember the Sabbath simultaneously. They also are they're trying to get across the idea that this was a different kind of experience. Hearing God's voice is not like hearing a normal human voice. And in a way, that's kind of going like, that's adding a third option. Like back in Exodus, it was either Kol is voice or Kol is thunder. But really, well, and even in Exodus, I think that there are other possible understandings of Kol. I think this is now even an additional one that, well, it was a voice, but God's voice is completely different than a human voice, and it can, as it were, magically do things that a human voice cannot do. Yes?
I think it's fantastic that our Torah puts these multiple stories, sometimes conflicting, but whatever it is, whether it's from the creation story to what we talked about today, to earlier or yesterday, you were talking about where the Ohel Moed is it outside and sometimes it's God's presence, or is it always with us?
Mm-hmm.
So we have that in our process of thinking and feeling and everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic. So my question is really, what is your
On one foot. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that question. It's really crucial to realize that, on the one hand, the Torah is, if I can maybe summarize you by adding another adjective, the Torah is, in significant ways, a pluralistic document. The Torah is not a book. The Torah is an anthology. You might even say maybe, if you think back to college. Sometimes in college you had to buy a textbook, right? By a particular author. But sometimes in colleges, at least when I was in college in ancient times, and they had these things called Xerox machines before the internet, we would have to go to like a Xerox place and get a course reader that had like 5 different articles or 15 different articles by 15 different scholars who would often disagree with each other. What I'm suggesting is the Torah is like the latter, not the former. The Torah is a text reader, it's not a book. It brings us a number of different perspectives. So in that respect, the Torah is multivocalic, and we Jews shouldn't be upset about the fact that we often disagree with each other. That's a feature, that's not a bug when we're in a Jewish context. Speaking with multiple voices that disagree with each other and argue with each other for the sake of glorifying God is something that we Jews should be comfortable with. It's something that we've been doing clearly since rabbinic times, but I'm arguing even since biblical times, on the one hand. On the other hand, when it comes to Revelation, there are different views about Revelation. We've actually just been in this set of lectures, we've been looking at how the Elohist strand of the Pentateuch and the Deuteronomic strand of the Pentateuch have different ideas about what happened at Revelation. We actually haven't even got into the priestly strand at all, or the J strand. There are 2 other strands that also describe the events that happened at Mount Sinai, and they've got other points of view that we haven't even gotten into. So there's at least 4 different views of Revelation at Sinai in the Torah itself. So we get this multiplicity of views, which I think probably reflects a multiplicity of historical memories. By the time these documents were being written down, we're centuries and centuries later than the event at Mount Sinai. And even at the event itself, it's probably the case that different people had different perceptions. That's a normal thing, that 2 different people see the same thing and describe it, maybe both of them accurately in very, very different ways, or they'll both describe it incompletely in different ways. So we're getting that pluralism. On the other hand, there are limits to the pluralism. It's interesting to me that all 4 of the documents, I think it's really, really significant that for all their differences, all 4 of the documents agree that the result of Revelation at Sinai was a covenantal law that we have to obey. Matan Torah was law-giving. That's not necessarily obvious. You could have an idea of Revelation that doesn't involve covenantal law. Actually, I mentioned this very, very briefly on Saturday morning. I think, let's say, Martin Buber is a modern theologian for whom there was such a thing and there is such a thing as revelation, and by definition, revelation never includes law. I think that in putting forward that notion of revelation, that Buber was placing himself outside the bounds of Jewish theology. For all the differences that you find back within the Torah about how revelation happened, the result is always a law code that we have to follow. They actually disagree as to what the law code was. P says that for Passover, it's absolutely necessary that you should roast the Passover offering. D says you should. I'm sorry, I said it backwards. P says you should boil the Passover offering. D says you should roast it and you should not boil it. D clearly knows P, and Fe don't do like those wayward P authors do. Instead we should do it this way. So there's differences about what the law is, but they all agree that the result was law. And so I think that whenever we're talking about pluralism, it's really important to understand the limits of pluralism. On the question of law-giving, for all the differences, the result is a law code that we as Jews have to obey. Now, what the law code is, there they differ. To what extent might that law code change over time? There's differences of opinion. The P author in particular, the priestly authors, are especially clear that human beings can lead to legitimate changes to the law code. That's especially clear in P. There are differences of opinion there, but law is always central. One other example of the limits of the pluralism, when you're talking about different understandings of God, the Bible has many, many different ways of understanding God, but the Bible is consistently monotheistic. The possibility that there may be more than one God is absolutely anathema from this pluralistic point of view. The possibility that there might be less than one God is absolutely anathema. Only the fool says, as chapter 14 of the book of Psalms, and again chapter 10, and again chapter 53, only the fool says, Ein Elohim. Amar naval belibo, Ein Elohim. Or the evil person in chapter 10, in Psalm 10, Ein Elohim ze kol mizimot harasha. That's what the evil person, that's everything that the evil person thinks. So atheism or polytheism, that's off the table. But then the truth is there's a lot of different kinds of monotheism just within the Bible itself, and then when you get to rabbinic literature, and even more so medieval philosophical and mystical literature, there's a lot of different kinds of monotheism, but neither polytheism nor atheism is an option. So on the one hand, you're right, there's pluralism in the Bible, but on the other hand, in asking this question, you're raising a really important issue of the limits of the pluralism. And when it comes to law, chiyuv, obligation, is central to all of these different points of view. Bill, your hand was up, I thought, maybe. Great question. So we've been engaging this whole weekend in very close reading of very ancient texts. And one can ask the question, this has been fun, but is it real? Were these authors really trying to communicate in this complex way in ancient literature? And I think that the proof is in the pudding. Does it work? The fact of the matter is that ancient authors were extremely, extremely thoughtful and careful authors. In the case of the Bible, Martin Buber, who as a theologian I think puts himself outside the bounds of Judaism, but was a great Jewish commentator on the Bible and a great Jewish cultural and political leader, Martin Buber and his colleague Franz Rosenzweig, they really make a strong case. I mean, a knockdown, drag-out case that yes, biblical authors deliberately would put a word in a narrative and then use that same word again in a different way later in the same narrative, and later again, what they called the leading word, or in German, the Leitwort, or in Hebrew, the Milah Mancha, is a crucial key to figuring out how meaning develops from these texts. And they have so many great examples that I think this is not a coincidence. They're right about this. This is something that ancient biblical authors do. And there are so many cases where it's specifically 7 or 3. The word appears 7 times, or it appears 3 times. Clearly, especially with 7, this is a way that a biblical author is deliberately signaling to you, this is the key word for this whole passage. Actually, and more generally regarding ancient literature, I think it really is the case that ancient authors read with the intention that their works would be interpreted very, very carefully, very, very closely. They wouldn't necessarily, it's actually not, I phrased that incorrectly. I said they composed with the intention that the text would be analyzed very, very closely. Now, probably it would be analyzed very closely by people who didn't actually read it with their eyes, because most people didn't know how to read and most people didn't own scrolls. What people would do is they would hear it, and the idea then was that they would chew over it, they would hear it again, they would maybe recite it to themselves. People memorize texts much, much more easily than we do in our culture, because most people didn't know how to read and physical texts were not very common. So people would analyze texts, would memorize texts fairly easily, and then would entertain themselves by chanting the text to themselves, and when they're reading it, or hearing it hearing themselves chant it again and again and again, they begin to notice patterns. And from those patterns, they begin to create meaning. If it was your turn to be, watching the sheepfold for at nighttime, and like you had an 8-hour shift, and you had to entertain yourself, and you didn't have a phone, and you didn't have a Walkman, and you didn't have a book, and even if you had a book, you didn't have a flashlight, how did you entertain yourself for those 8 hours? You had memorized texts, and in your head, or maybe even out loud, you would chant them to yourself, and as you chant them again and again and again, you begin to notice the same word shows up, the same phrase shows up. You begin to notice patterns, and you begin to wonder, why are those patterns there? So I think that shepherds would notice the stuff that we were talking about. They would be doing the sort of close reading that I'm suggesting. Also remember that in antiquity, words were more precious than they are for us. If you think about just the amount, before the internet, for those of us who lived in ancient times in the second millennium, think about back in 1980, how much text came into your house on a weekly basis. You subscribed to the newspaper, you subscribed to the New Yorker, you got letters, you got bills. The number of words coming into your household before the internet was massive, and that it's exploded since then. In antiquity, if you owned, even in the Middle Ages before the invention of the printing press, if you owned a library of 50 books, that was extraordinary. There are stories of rabbis in Europe in the Middle Ages walking 300 miles because they heard that there's a guy who has such and such a book. They would walk 300 miles to go to that rabbi, spend 2 days reading the book carefully, memorizing it, and then walk home. In a culture in which there are fewer books, whether we're talking about ancient Israelite culture or medieval culture or ancient Greek culture or Babylonian culture, words, the written word, the composed word, literature, was much more rare. The words were more rare, they were more yakar, and therefore they were more valuable. They were more yakar. That's the point. It's easier to make in Hebrew than in English. They were more precious, and therefore it was a given that you're supposed to really pay close attention to them. So I would say, actually, if anything, I'd say that, alas, modern writers often write off the cuff with the assumption that this isn't so deep, people are going to read it really, really quickly, so I don't have to write deeply because no one's going to read deeply. But in antiquity, people who wrote literature, they were writing to be read very, very, very deeply. The sort of very close reading that we do in Jewish contexts, that is very loyal to the ancient context of our books. Maybe one or two more questions? Yes?
There is the rabbinic view that the people heard the first two commandments.
The first two, yeah.
There's a verbal version of this, that the first two commandments are recited, are articulated in first person, and three following in third person. Therefore, only God spoke the first two. It is clear to be a non-verbal version of this, that if all that they perceived was the thunder and the earthquake and this awesome event happened, that they experienced that as God. God was non-verbally telling them, I am God, and you better not have any other God. And that would be the way of understanding the first two commandments.
I certainly think so. So you're alluding to the interpretation found on page 6, first in the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Makot, but it appears in a number of other places in the Gemara as well, that the people heard only the first two dibrot, the first two of the commandments. The support for that you're suggesting, that the first two commandments are spoken in the first person and second person, God is speaking to you, whereas from the third commandment on, it's in the first and the third persons. God is speaking about the Israelites. That's the explanation that Yosef Kara gives on the bottom of page 6. But then other thinkers take that kind of reasoning even further and say, well, it's not that they didn't hear the whole Ten Commandments, they didn't even hear the first two. They heard no words at all, but they did hear a real communication. That's, I think, what the Ropshitzer Rebbe is doing in the passage that's quoted from the Zera Kodesh. It's actually really the Rumenover Rebbe's oral teaching that the Ropshitzer quotes. That's what he's saying. They only heard the aw, the Kamatz Aleph aw. You also see a version of that in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, which I didn't include in the handout. Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed makes it very, very clear the people didn't hear any actual words because the people didn't hear a voice because God doesn't speak in words, God doesn't have a voice, God doesn't have a throat. In fact, Maimonides makes it clear that if you think the people heard words, you're a polytheist. Even if you believe there's only one God, but you believe that that one God made sounds that were words, that's already avodah zarah, that's already polytheism. So for Maimonides, it's clear that the people heard something or they experienced something, but it did not involve words. And Maimonides also makes clear, this gets complicated, but Maimonides also makes clear, the argument has been made by Maimonides scholars, and I am not a Maimonides scholar, but various scholars of Maimonides have made the argument that Maimonides in the Guide of the Perplexed is making it clear to the careful reader that Moses wrote the Torah, that the laws of the Torah are written by Moses, not by God. It's interesting, actually, the first person to really write an article on this was a Reform rabbi who was a professor at HUC. It was a really radical thesis. About 15 years later, a conservative rabbi who taught at Duke University wrote a second article agreeing with that thesis, but pushing it a bit further and making it a bit more radical. And then an Orthodox rabbi who taught at McGill University wrote an article saying, well, the first two articles don't really fully recognize how radical Maimonides was. In other words, as the scholar writing this article goes further to the right, they're taking the argument further to the left. Micha Goodman, in his book on Maimonides, also suggests this, and he has a whole different line of reasoning to come to the same conclusion. So there, interestingly, both in the most philosophical part of the philosophical tradition in Maimonides and in a certain kind of mystical tradition in Hasidic literature, you get the idea that God spoke, but non-verbally. Tov, toda rabah, and I wish everybody a chodesh tov and a chag matan Torah sameach. Toda rabah.